So you mentioned that it's very important for the Western or European partners of Ukraine really to mention that they would support as much as possible, and then the Wall Street and the others would, trust, invest. But who should really and in what form clearly state that? Because there are a lot of talks of support. And how different it would be.
I think the appropriate forum for such a formal policy statement of, sustained support for Ukraine should come from the European Council, the president of which happens to be from Poland, President Tusk. So I think that's the business of the European Council, to make a formal policy declaration and to declare that this is one of the foreign policy objectives which the European Union, meaning the Commission and the Council and the Parliament, will pursue jointly.
And you've mentioned that it's really not in the nearest future for Ukraine to join NATO. But clearly what should be and what could be this policy for the countries which are not member allies, while those countries don't feel that they are behind or they have at least some goal? I mean, if you speak like feasibly, because the general words of support and cooperation after some time also not really taken seriously.
Well, this is a very difficult question, and I have great sympathy for the countries who have not been able to join NATO in the past, and for whom there may not now be an easy way into NATO. Because, you see, joining NATO requires two things. It requires that the country that wants to join NATO is going to be united, domestically speaking, in its determination to join NATO. That is not probably true in the case of Ukraine. You have some parts of your country that have a problem. So we would be dividing Ukraine even more than it is by raising the question. The second problem is all the members of NATO must be willing to defend Ukraine in case of a conflict. That is not so easy. We had a very hard time in the initial NATO enlargement round. Would we all agree to defend Poland? Wasn't so easy to answer. And I can tell you that at this moment, you would not have a consensus among all the members of NATO to defend Ukraine. Therefore, there will not be an invitation by NATO, because it needs to have consensus. There will not be an invitation issued anytime soon to Ukraine. Let's be realistic. That is the situation. One can say this is terrible, but this is the fact.
You speak, what are the feasible instruments of influencing Russia? We understand there are sanctions, on general terms. There is a Minsk agreement, but there are individual cases of the Ukrainians who had been kidnapped and now sentenced in Russia, like Oleg Sentsov, Alexander Kolchenko, Nadia Savchenko, and these are particular human cases which can't last, not mention as long as sanctions works. So in that particular case, what could be the policy besides the talks and demands on doing something with these particular individuals?
In foreign policy, one of the important issues is always the question of, is somebody going to lose face if you agree or if you disagree, if you do this or if you don't do that? In the case of such cases, humanitarian cases, people who are arrested or jailed or accused, I think there are solutions, but the best solutions in those cases are quiet solutions. Remember, some time ago, it was possible through what we call quiet diplomacy to get Mr. Khodorkovsky released from Russia. All of a sudden, he was gone. He now lives in Switzerland. So it is possible. But that was done without anyone losing face, quiet diplomacy. For these cases, that's the best way.
Well, there would be local elections in so-called DNR against these Minsk agreements. So, what is a feasible thing in that in that case? Are they working, or what is the prospect?
Well, you can always say the glass is half full or it's half empty. I tend to be more on the optimistic side. I think we now, if the ceasefire holds, this is already the first step. It took almost a year now to get that done. If we can create a situation where the separatist elections are held in accordance with and on the date arranged with Kiev, then it's good. If they pursue to implement their plan of holding their own elections on their own terms, I think that would be a terrible setback, and it would make the Minsk process not impossible, but much more difficult. Again, we should only go back to normal business once the entire Minsk package is implemented. It's not good enough to have a ceasefire. It's not good enough to have the elections in eastern Ukraine. We need the most important part of the Minsk agreement is the Ukrainian border and its control by Ukraine. That is what should come at the end, and only when that has been achieved is the Minsk process completed.
And very shortly, the final was regarding the cooperation and the dialogue or any agreement with Russia and Putin. So in particular now, in case of Syria, and you know, it's again a very vocal and outspoken issue these days, with Mr. Putin coming to the General Assembly and trying to make the, you know, to save the face, wherever you call it. So in what case there would be the trust in cooperation, in partnership with Russia within regards in Syria, bearing in mind the situation in Ukraine and Russian role in Ukraine?
Look, I think I would apply the same principles which we have applied to the negotiations with Tehran. Don't just trust some promises, but verify. Don't trust the words, look at what the actions are. And I think that there is a possibility of working with Russia under certain conditions. We worked with Russia, let's admit it, very well on Iran. Russia was a full and positive participant, because in this case our interests were identical. Maybe not identical, but compatible. There are some other areas where this is possible. There are areas where it is currently not possible. This is the art of diplomacy, of increasing the areas where we work together and decreasing the areas where we disagree. It's a long-term process, will take a long time, but let's not give up.
Any short-term results? Because you know there is a lot of buzz about this upcoming visit and the attempts to make a deal.
I would be surprised if out of the UN meeting would come a miracle solution. It can take us forward a little step, but don't expect too much.